Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Ben Clarke and you're listening to Freshaphonica, an audio documentary podcast covering stories from music and entertainment history. This episode is entitled Beyond the Beatles Part 1, and I look at the fascinating story behind George Harrison's first solo album, the soundtrack to the 1968 movie Wonderwall.
This is Freshaphonica, you mothers.
If I'm going to say something, I'd like it to have some kind of importance, some value, so that, you know, in 20 years' time, it's not just some dumb song that made, you know, some royalties. I mean, the royalties are nice, but it would be good to be able to have something a little deeper.
I find him a great human being. I think he came to this planet to spread the message of love, message of humanity, and message of how you can be a very humble person after reaching heights of skies, you know. Who can be better known than George Harrison?
No, I don't like songs. Music is just organized noise, and noise is poison to the mind.
During 1967, the Beatles had been working on the Magical Mystery Tour movie and soundtrack. The film debuted on the BBC on Boxing Day 1967 and was supposed to be one of the highlights of British TV that Christmas. However, while the music received positive reviews, the film itself received a fairly negative response from the critics. Arguably due to the fact that their manager Brian Epstein had died in the early stages of planning, the film gave the impression of disorganisation and a lack of creative control, and it marked the first time that the Beatles had produced something a little underwhelming in what had so far been a glittering career. Broadcaster Paul Gambaccini simply didn't get the concept of getting on a bus and not knowing the destination.
It's a very English concept that you have old dears that you like to be around no matter how hip you are, and that you have extended family that you're not embarrassed by. And the people on that coach were old dears and extended family. So it just seemed like a very odd thing for the Beatles to want to do. The Beatles were cultural mission control. They were where it was at. Culture was them, they were culture. Why are they hanging around with fat old women?
Doing so bad? You're a Skinner's armholes every week. What's the matter with you?
What's the matter with you? You've moaned ever since we got on this bus.
Well, I promised your father I'd take you. I'm sorry now, I'm dead sorry.
Well, I'm sorry.
Magical Mystery Tour was really Paul McCartney's project, and watching it back, it's very noticeable that George Harrison hardly features in the movie at all. After several trips to India, George was really starting to hit his stride as a songwriter, and was also developing strong interests outside the band, including studying Indian culture and receiving sitar lessons from Ravi Shankar. It was also around this time that Harrison was becoming increasingly frustrated with not being able to get his songs on Beatles albums.
Over the years, you know, I had such a lot of songs mounting up that I really wanted to do, but I only got my quota of 1 or 2 tunes per album. And that way I would have had to have recorded about 100 Beatle albums just to get out the tunes I had in 1965.
Beatles recording engineer Ken Scott also felt George's need to do something on his own.
I think he was totally confident about the songs. The insecurity may have been, if the Beatles kept going, how many songs am I going to be able to get on each album? And with the backlog sort of mounting up of songs that he had, get it out there and get something from it.
In late 1967, he was given the perfect opportunity to flex his musical muscles in a way that wasn't possible in the confines of the band. This project led to George Harrison being the first Beatle to release a solo album. American film director Joe Masseau had originally met Harrison on the set of Help in 1965, and they'd regularly bumped into each other on the London club scene. The Beatles had briefly featured in Masseau's critically acclaimed short film Reflections on Love, which was nominated for the Best Short Film Prize at the 1966 Cannes Film Festival. Masseau's next movie was to be called Wonderwall, a voyeuristic psychedelic film about a socially challenged scientist who spies on the model who lives next door through the connecting wall in his house. The set designs were being done by the Dutch art collective The Fool, who had designed some album art on Sgt. Pepper and had painted the Beatles' Apple boutique on Baker Street, so it seemed natural to get George in to do the soundtrack. Musician and arranger John Barham took part in the Wonderwall sessions and felt director Joe Masseau had a clear vision of what he wanted for what was to be his first feature-length movie.
As far as I understood it from Joe, he wanted to, in a way, to be like a trip, an LSD trip. And there's one scene which is very memorable. I mean, I thought it was very good at the time because I was in the sound dubbing process. And so I saw it over and over again. It's a scene I really liked, is where it's in black and white and then gradually goes into colour, which I thought was very close to some of the experiences one does have under LSD. So that's what I think he was trying to do.
However, Harrison was initially concerned that he wouldn't be able to provide anything suitable, as he'd never scored a movie before. He also wasn't the only musician in the running to provide the soundtrack to Wonderwall. The Bee Gees had expressed an interest in being involved, as had Graham Nash, but George was Masseau's first choice, and he assured the hesitant Harrison that anything he came up with would be included in the film. An excited George Harrison watched a rough cut of the movie at Twickenham Studios and made notes on musical ideas as he was watching. He even used a stopwatch to time segments of the film with the aim of composing pieces to fit exactly into those slots. In late 1967, George took his rough musical sketches into Abbey Road Studios and recorded with the Remo 4, a fellow Liverpool group, as his backing band. Also present at the sessions were a couple of seemingly unheard of musicians, credited on the album cover as Eddie Clayton on guitar and Richie Snare on drums. In actual fact, these two nobodies were none other than Eric Clapton and Ringo Starr. All the musicians at the London recording sessions were only given a loose framework of instructions by George, and he was happy for the musical themes to evolve and change as necessary, which is exactly what happened. Eric Clapton explains.
It was really just, I showed up, George told me if he'd like me to play on something or we'd write something as we went along. We put down this thing and George then put backwards guitar on top of it and was... it was very experimental and it was good fun.
In addition to the psychedelic pop motifs that had been recorded in London, George Harrison felt that the Wonderwall soundtrack would be a great way of exploring the Indian sounds he'd been getting into. He'd experimented as a beginner with the sitar on Beatles tracks like Norwegian Wood and got a bit more sophisticated on Love to You and Within You Without You. Now he had the chance to delve even further into his new Eastern passion.
I don't really know exactly when, but when I first noticed that I was interested in this, with the music first of all, I think, and along with that I'd heard stories of people in caves, yogis as they're known, people levitating and dematerializing and doing all sorts of wondrous things. And then through the music, with meeting Ravi and just all the groovy people of Brahmins, like the scientists and religious people and musicians and all those. And then in the end, I'd like to become this myself, I'd just like to have this quality that these people have, which is a spiritual thing.
In January 1968, Harrison flew to India and spent 5 days in Bombay at EMI Studios with an assembled group of traditional Indian musicians. So passionate was George about making his Indian ideas part of the Wonderwall soundtrack that it's rumoured this short trip to India cost around £15,000 out of his own pocket, a small fortune in 1968. Indian musician Shiv Kumar Sharma recognised George Harrison's dedication to Indian music and its culture.
He realised this music is just not an entertainment. This is something much, much more beyond that. And that is the spiritual content in our music, which takes you inward. And I think these factors of our music attracted George. Because Indian music is just not playing music or learning music. You have to change your whole personality, your thinking process. It's a living tradition which is centuries old.
We didn't underestimate George. We knew that he was peaking. As we got to those records. He'd not been really interested in the beginning, I don't think. And because John and I did so much of the writing, he could just leave it to us. But I think he realized, that there was something in this, that artistically and financially, it was a good thing to get into. So by that time, we realized that he was really coming up with the goods.
Wonderwall the movie was shown at the Cannes Film Festival in the summer of 1968 and premiered in London in January 1969. After that, it pretty much sank without a trace for almost 30 years until the Oasis hit single of the same name prompted director Joe Masseau to revisit the movie, and it was restored and released on DVD in 1998. George's accompanying soundtrack album, Wonderwall Music, was released in the UK and the US in late 1969, becoming the first solo album to be released by any of the Beatles. It was also the first album released on their newly formed Apple Records label. Although it didn't even make the album charts in the UK, it's by far the most interesting thing about the movie, and is probably the main reason the movie still receives any attention today.
I got caught for speeding the first day I got in a car, and the policeman, I stopped, I had to open the back of the car to get my driver's license out to show him, and he said, you look like one of the Rolling Stones. And I said, oh, really?
That was Beyond the Beatles, Part 1. I've been Ben Clarke, and thanks for listening. Freshaphonica is available to listen to at freshaphonica.com, or you can subscribe via iTunes. Show notes are available on the website, and if you like what you heard, please share it with a Beatles or George Harrison fan. Until next time.
Oh, Diane, thank you ever so much. It's been really wonderful for you to have me.